My name is Brandon Harlan. I am 42 years old. I run a construction company my father built with his bare hands in Houston, Texas. And for 20 years, I believed one thing above everything else: that a man who kept his word, worked his land, and loved his family would never have to worry about losing them. I was wrong. On a Tuesday morning in April, I walked into an office building in uptown Houston carrying a bouquet of deep red roses and 2 first-class tickets to Charleston, South Carolina. I walked out of that same building without the roses, without the tickets, and without the woman I had spent 15 years of my life standing beside. What I walked out with instead was something I did not expect. The clearest picture I had ever seen of exactly who my wife was. And here's the part nobody tells you. The part that still keeps me awake on certain nights when I am sitting on the back porch in the woodlands, and the cicadas are doing their thing, and Jaden is inside at the kitchen table, working on his homework. The part that matters most is not what she did in that office. It is what I found out she had been doing for 18 months before I ever stepped off that elevator. But we will get there. That Tuesday started the way most good surprises do. Quietly, carefully, with a man trying his best. I had been on a job site in Katy since 5:30 in the morning. The crew was pouring foundation on a commercial build off I-10, and the April heat was already doing its best to remind everybody why people in Houston own ceiling fans in every single room. By 9 o'clock, my shirt was damp, and my boots were caked with red clay. But I had a plan. My wife worked for a financial services firm on Post Oak Boulevard, one of those polished uptown high-rises, with a lobby waterfall and a security desk and valets out front who never make eye contact. Her office was throwing a mid-quarter staff appreciation luncheon that day. She had mentioned it the week before, the way you mention things to a spouse when you are half watching television and half scrolling your phone. She hadn't invited me. She never did. But I had called her assistant, a kind young woman named Priya, and confirmed the time. I left the job site at 11, stopped at a florist on Westheimer Road. The woman behind the counter had silver hair and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, and she wrapped those red roses the way only certain women wrap flowers. Slowly, deliberately, like she understood exactly what they were for. "Special occasion?" she asked. "Trying to be," I told her. I changed my shirt in the cab of my pickup, smoothed it down, checked the plane tickets in my chest pocket. 2 seats, Friday morning, Charleston. I had booked a room at a small inn on Sullivan's Island because my wife had said once, years ago when we were still the kind of couple who talked about things like that she had always wanted to see the Atlantic from the Carolina coast. I remembered. I drove up Post Oak, valeted the truck, walked into the lobby of the high-rise, and rode the elevator to the 15th floor, feeling, I will be honest, nervous. The good kind of nervous. The kind that reminds you that you still care deeply about a person, that you still want to be the reason they smile. The elevator doors opened, and the room went completely still. Not the kind of still where people pause and look up, the kind where the air itself stops moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. Someone's hand froze over a keyboard. A woman near the window holding a glass of sparkling water went rigid, and I watched her eyes find me and immediately find somewhere else to be. I had worked construction long enough to know when a room was holding its breath. This room was holding its breath. I tightened my grip around the rose stems. A thorn found my palm. I felt the small, bright sting of it and the warm press of blood against my fingers, but I did not look down. I kept my face the way my father had taught me to keep it in situations where other men were watching. Composed, unhurried, and mine. Then the conference room door swung open. My wife walked out first. She was wearing the camel blazer I had bought her for Christmas. Her hair was done. She looked beautiful the way she always looked beautiful. Polished, put together, every inch of herself arranged on purpose. On her left hand was a diamond ring I had never seen before. It was large. It was new. It was not from me. Xavier Crane stepped out behind her. Broad-shouldered, mid-50s, the kind of man who owned every room he walked into because he paid the lease on all of them. He was her boss. I had met him exactly twice. He had shaken my hand both times with a wide, confident smile that I now understood differently. He put his hand on the small of her back. He pulled her into him. He kissed her, long, slow, and deliberate, in front of every single person in that office. 3 seconds of absolute silence. Then someone started clapping. I looked at her. She looked at me. Something moved across her face. Not shame exactly, more like the expression of someone who has dropped something fragile and is watching it fall, and knows there is nothing left to do but wait for the sound. My own voice came out of my chest, low and level, barely recognizable as mine. Congratulations. When's the wedding? I set the roses on the white reception desk. Red on white, like a bloodstain on fresh snow. I turned and walked back to the elevator without looking back. I did not want anyone to see my face in that moment. Stay with me, because what Brandon finds waiting for him at home that evening will change everything he thought he understood about how long this had really been going on. People ask what I did after I walked out of that building. They expect me to say I called a lawyer, or drove to a bar somewhere dark and anonymous on Richmond Avenue and sat there until I couldn't feel anything. Or maybe just pulled over somewhere on the Southwest Freeway and let everything come apart. Here is what I actually did. I drove home to the Woodlands on the Woodlands Parkway with the radio completely off, both hands on the wheel, and the 2 plane tickets to Charleston sitting on the passenger seat beside me. I drove exactly the speed limit the entire way. I stopped fully at every stop sign. I used my turn signal at every lane change, every single one. Because there are certain moments when maintaining control over small things is the only way to keep from losing control over everything else. Jaden was already in the kitchen when I walked in. He was sitting at the table with his hands folded in front of him and his basketball shoes still on, which he knew I didn't allow inside the house. I didn't say a word about the shoes, because the look on his face told me everything. My son is 16. He is tall, taller than me now, something he points out every chance he gets. He plays forward on his high school team, and his coach says he has a natural sense of the floor, meaning he always sees where everyone is before the play develops. I used to think that was just basketball instinct. I understand now it was something deeper. Jaden looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us spoke. Then he said, quietly, "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have told you sooner." 4 months earlier, on a Sunday morning after a church basketball game, Jaden had been dropped off near Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, the same church where my wife had been attending her women's Bible study. Or so I had believed. Jaden had seen her in that parking lot, in the middle of a Sunday morning, in Xavier Crane's arms. Not the way colleagues hold each other. Not the way people hold each other when they are surprised to run into someone they know on a Sunday morning. He had carried that image for 4 months, through family dinners and school nights, and weekend trips to the job site. 4 months of knowing and staying silent, because in his own words, he didn't want to be the one who broke the family apart. I pulled my chair around so I was sitting beside him instead of across from him. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Son," I said, "that was never your job. That was never something you were supposed to carry. Do you hear me?" He nodded, but his eyes were already wet. I did not call a lawyer that evening. Instead, while there was still a little daylight left, I went out to the backyard and started fixing the basketball hoop that Jaden and his grandfather had built together 8 years ago. It had been leaning 5 degrees to the left since the last storm that came through, and I had been telling myself I'd fix it for months. I don't know exactly why I chose that evening. Maybe I just needed to put my hands on something that could actually be made right. Jaden came outside and held the post steady while I tightened the bolts at the base. We worked without talking for a while. The good kind of silence. The kind between two people who already understand each other. At some point, I asked him, "Do you want me to do this? The divorce? Do you want me to go through with it?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me steadily, and the tears he had been holding back finally came. "Yeah, Dad," he said. "I do." I nodded, went back to the bolt, didn't say anything more. That was enough. That night, I made roasted chicken, Jaden's favorite, the way my mother made it, with lemon and garlic and smoked paprika, rubbed the night before and rested in the refrigerator. I had come home from a construction site, discovered my wife's betrayal announced in front of an entire floor of witnesses, and I still stood at that stove at 9:30 at night and cooked my son a proper meal. I tell you that not to impress anyone. I tell you that because sometimes the only thing standing between your grief and your complete collapse is a task. A real, ordinary, get-your-hands-into-it task. The smell of garlic browning in olive oil, the weight of a cast-iron pan, the click of the oven door closing. Sometimes that is enough to keep you upright. We sat at the table, and I helped Jaden finish a history assignment about the civil rights movement in Houston, specifically the community work along Dowling Street in the 3rd Ward. We sat there until almost midnight. At some point, his head went down onto his textbook, and he fell asleep right there at the table. I covered him with the blanket from the couch. Then I stood over him for a long moment and said, quietly enough that he couldn't possibly hear me, "I will not let you be forced to choose between your mother and me anymore." My wife called 11 times that night. I answered on the 12th. She spoke first, in a voice that was measured and careful, the voice of a woman who had already decided what position she was taking before she picked up the phone. She spoke about distance and difficulty, framed things as a mutual failure, the way people do when they are trying to manage a story rather than tell the truth. I did not give her a speech. I asked one question. "How long has this been going on?" She said, 12 months. But even as she said it, I heard something underneath, a fraction of a pause, a slight thinning on the number, the specific sound of a person offering the smallest version of a larger truth, just enough to seem honest, not enough to be it. I said, "All right," and I ended the call. I stood in the kitchen for a while after, in the quiet house, listening to Jaden's slow breathing from down the hall. 12 months. That was the answer she gave. But I had built things for a living long enough to know that what you can see on the surface is rarely where the real structure begins. You have to go down to the foundation. And the foundation, I was starting to understand, went much deeper than 12 months. The most dangerous kind of betrayal is not an affair. It is a plan, drawn quietly in the dark, over months and years, while the other person is still trusting you completely. When a former coworker slips an unmarked envelope under Brandon's windshield wiper in a Conroe parking lot, the hidden plan Casey had been running for 18 months begins to unravel. And the stakes turn out to be far greater than a marriage. 3 weeks after the office, a man named Darnell Moore slid an envelope under my windshield wiper in the parking lot of a Home Depot in Conroe. Darnell was a former project manager I had worked alongside years back. A solid man, the kind who showed up early, stayed late, and never asked for more credit than he earned. We had lost touch when he moved to a firm downtown. He hadn't called ahead. There was no return address on the envelope, just my name on the front in blue ink, in his handwriting. I sat in the cab of my truck and opened it. I looked at what was inside for a long time. Then I folded it carefully, put it in the glove compartment, drove to the job site, and worked until sunset without saying a word to anyone. The envelope did not simply document my wife's affair with Xavier Crane. I had already known about that. What it documented was a second relationship, one I had not allowed myself to imagine. Even in the darkest version of this story, I had run through in my mind. Among the photographs and printed message screenshots was evidence linking Casey to a senior executive at a downtown Houston firm. I will not give her name here. She had her own family, and in the end she was, in her own way, also deceived. But the name of her company is what stopped my breath when I read it. Her firm held the largest single contract Harlan Construction had ever signed. A multi-million-dollar commercial development project along the I-69 corridor. The contract that was going to carry my father's company from regional to something larger. The contract I had been building toward for a decade. The one I had told Jaden, more than once, that he would one day inherit as part of his legacy. If that relationship became public, and Cassie, I now understood, had almost certainly calculated that it would, eventually, that contract could be voided overnight on conflict of interest grounds. The reputation of Harlan Construction, the legacy my father had spent 35 years building board by board, could be pulled down by a scandal that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with a plan I had never been shown. I need you to sit with that for a moment. This was not impulsive behavior. This was not a woman who stumbled into a bad situation and made a choice that snowballed out of control. This was a woman who had identified every pillar of my life, my business, my reputation, my most important professional relationships, and had quietly positioned herself adjacent to each one. Who had, with patience and precision, mapped out the architecture of everything I valued and placed herself where she could reach the load-bearing walls. The most dangerous person in your life is not the one who attacks you in the open. It is the one who sits across from you at dinner, smiling, while she reads the wiring diagram of everything you love. I called Xavier Crane. I want to be clear. I did not want to. The man had kissed my wife in front of her entire office and accepted applause for it. He was not someone I had any interest in speaking to. But I had his number from an old business card, and I needed information more than I needed my dignity in that particular moment. He answered on the second ring. He sounded, and I choose this word carefully, relieved. In the first 30 seconds, without much prompting, he admitted that Casey had deceived him, that there were things about her he was only now beginning to understand. He used the word victim once, referring to himself. I did not respond to that word. I let him talk. Then he said he wanted to make a deal. He had information he was willing to share. He just wanted certain considerations in return. I told him I didn't make deals. I told him that if he had information relevant to my divorce proceedings, he could provide it to my attorney voluntarily, or he could keep it to himself. But I was not going to negotiate with him at a table of his choosing. Silence on the line. Then he said, "All right." I hung up. The following Thursday morning, overcast, the kind of Houston morning where the humidity settles into your clothes before you've made it from the driveway to the car, my wife was served with divorce papers at her office on Post Oak Boulevard. The process had been initiated through Patricia Okafor, an attorney in Midtown who a college friend had referred me to the week after the office incident. Patricia was methodical, unflappable, and precise. She had looked at everything I brought her, looked at me, and said with the calm efficiency of someone who had navigated every version of this story, "We're going to need to move carefully and completely. Are you ready for that?" I had said yes. When Patricia called to confirm the papers had been served, I was standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold on the counter beside me. "She stood in the lobby for several minutes afterward," Patricia said, in the tone of someone reporting a weather observation. "Didn't move. Her assistant had to come down." I didn't respond to that. I thanked Patricia and ended the call. What I felt in that moment was not satisfaction. I want to be clear about that. There is a version of this kind of story where the wronged husband gets a quiet, personal thrill from watching the other party face consequences, and I understand the appeal of that version. But what I actually felt, standing in my kitchen that morning, was something simpler and colder. Clarity. The particular clarity that comes when you finally stop arguing with yourself about what is real. Because this was the moment. Not the office, not the phone call, not Darnell's envelope. This was the moment I finally understood the full shape of what Casey had been building. She had not simply wanted to leave me. A woman who wants to leave a marriage leaves. She files, she divides fairly, she moves forward. That is painful, but it is honest. It is something two people can survive with their integrity intact. What Casey had wanted was different. She had wanted to leave with everything. The company, the contracts, the assets accumulated over 15 years of marriage, the liquidity I had reinvested rather than spent, the legacy my father had given his working life to create so that his son and his grandson would have something solid beneath them. She had wanted to leave me with the name and nothing else. And she had been working toward that outcome for much longer than 12 months. That was the thing I could not move past. Not the affair, not the humiliation in the office, not even the diamond ring she'd been wearing when she looked across that room at me. What I could not forgive was this. She had looked at Jaden, our son, our 16-year-old boy who had held a post steady in the backyard, and wept and said, "Yeah, Dad, I do." And she had decided that none of it was worth the cost of being honest. That was the line. What Xavier Crane reveals in his sworn statement will expose something even Darnell's envelope didn't show. A hidden company, 18 months of moved money, and a launch date already set for 6 months after she collected her half of Harlan Construction. Xavier Crane submitted his sworn statement to Patricia's office on a Friday afternoon. I read it that same evening at the kitchen table, after Jaden had gone to bed, with a cup of coffee gone cold beside me, and the kind of deep stillness in the house that only settles in after a long and difficult week. I read every page twice. Then I set it down and looked out the window at the backyard. At the basketball hoop standing perfectly straight now under the April night sky. And I thought, she started this before the affair. That was the thing that kept landing differently from everything else. According to Xavier's statement, Casey had incorporated a business entity, a financial consulting firm registered in Delaware but operating out of Houston, A full 18 months before that Tuesday in April. 18 months before I stepped off that elevator with roses in my hand. 18 months of Sunday mornings and dinner conversations and Jaden's basketball games. And running on a quiet, parallel track underneath all of it was a company she had been building with our money. Marital funds. Transferred in small, careful increments, just below the thresholds that trigger automatic flags. The kind of transfers that require patience, that require discipline, that require a person to look you in the eye over breakfast every morning while moving money out of your life, piece by piece. She had already identified investors. She had vendor relationships in place, a website registered under a name I had never heard, and a launch date. Xavier had seen the documents himself, set for approximately 6 months after she, in his words, quoting directly what she had told him, got her half of the construction company. Half of Harlan Construction. My father's legacy. Elroy Harlan had started that company with a single dump truck, a used transit mixer, and a handshake reputation in the 3rd Ward of Houston. He had spent 35 years turning it into something his son could be proud of and his grandson could inherit. He had passed away 6 years ago. One of the last things he said to me, I was holding his hand at the Methodist Hospital on the Texas Medical Center campus, and he was already drifting, was, "Don't let them take the company, son. That company is Jaden's future." I had promised him I wouldn't. That night, I did not go home right away. I drove east on I-10 and pulled into the parking lot of the commercial job site we had been working near Channelview. The lot was empty, the site dark, the only light coming from a distant string of highway lamps. I sat there in my old F250 with the engine running and the radio off. In the back seat of that truck was my father's hard hat. It had been riding back there for 2 years. I knew I should bring it inside. I never could bring myself to. Next to it, Jaden's basketball, slightly deflated, the way it always got when the Houston weather shifted. He had asked me twice to bring it in for air. I kept forgetting. I sat with those 2 things behind me for a long time. Then I found the voicemail, the one I keep in a folder on my phone, marked only with my father's initials. I had listened to it maybe 100 times since he passed, never when anyone else was around. I pressed play. His voice came through the truck speaker, raspy and warm, and unmistakably his. "Brandon, son, I know things have been hard lately, but I want you to hear this. A man is not someone who never cries. A man is someone who knows when to cry and when to stand back up for his children. You've always known both. I'm proud of you. I love you." 23 seconds. I listened to it 3 times. Then I held his hard hat in both hands and I let myself cry. Not the controlled, composed kind I had been managing privately since the office. The real kind. The kind that sounds ugly and doesn't care who would hear. The kind that has been building behind a dam for weeks and finally finds the crack. I sat there in that dark parking lot and let it all come out. And then, I am going to be fully honest about this, because you deserve the whole story, and not just the version where the husband is strong from beginning to end. After the crying stopped, I almost called her. I picked up my phone. Her name was already on the recent calls screen. I sat there with my thumb hovering over it, and I thought about Jaden. About what divorce does to a 16-year-old boy at the exact midpoint of becoming himself. About college visits and basketball seasons, and whether a boy recovers from his family splitting apart at this specific age, or whether it leaves something in him that never fully heals. I thought about all the things I could say if I called. The possibility, the small, exhausted possibility, that people had come back from worse than this, that families had found a way through it, that maybe, if I was willing to look away from enough of it, we could maintain something that resembled stability for our son. I sat with that thought for what felt like a very long time. Then I looked at Jaden's basketball in the back seat, and I heard his voice again from that first night at the kitchen table. "Yeah, Dad, I do." He had not said that easily. He had said it with tears running down his face, and 4 months of a terrible secret finally leaving his chest. He had said it knowing exactly what it cost. He had said it as a gift to me, and as an act of faith in the truth. If I called Casey and pulled back from this, if I let the fear of what divorce does to a child override what growing up inside a deliberate lie does to a child, I would be teaching my son something specific and permanent. I would be teaching him that the truth has a price, and that the price is low enough to be settled in a parking lot on a difficult night. I could not teach him that. Not Elroy Harlan's grandson. Not my son. I turned the phone off. I set the hard hat gently back in the seat. I put the truck in drive. I said out loud to nobody in the cab but myself and maybe my father, "I cannot let my son grow up inside a lie." And I drove home. There is something nobody tells you about this particular kind of pain. The kind that is not only grief and anger, but a slow, grinding recognition that someone you loved made a long-term plan, and you were never in it. They do not tell you that the hardest moment is not when you find out. The hardest moment is the quiet parking lot 3 weeks later, when you understand the full size of what was being dismantled around you. And you still have to choose, freely, consciously, with full knowledge of the cost, to protect your son's future over the comfort of not having to feel any of this. That is the moment that defines a man. Not the office, not the roses on the white desk. This moment, in the dark, alone. I drove home. At the mediation meeting in downtown Houston, Casey arrives composed and prepared. But the moment Jaden stands up and places a small recorder on the conference table, every strategy she has spent 18 months constructing begins to come apart at once. The mediation was held on the 22nd floor of a building on Lamar Street in downtown Houston. The room was cream-colored, corporate, deliberately neutral. Large windows faced west and let in late-morning light that fell across the table at an angle too bright for the kind of conversation we were about to have. There was a long conference table, upholstered chairs, a carafe of water nobody touched, and a mediator named Gerald Foss, who wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried the permanent, careful neutrality of a man who had spent his career listening to other people's worst moments. Kessie came in with her attorney and sat across the table from me and Patricia. She was dressed well, as always, hair done, composed. I noticed these things the way you notice the details of a place you are visiting for the last time. Carefully, without feeling. She began to cry within the first 20 minutes. Not the private kind of crying, the measured kind, visible enough to observe, restrained enough to appear dignified. She spoke about distance in the marriage, a husband always at the job site, a woman who had felt invisible. Her attorney built a careful picture, a neglected wife who had found love elsewhere because the love at home had grown cold. She positioned Casey not as someone who had made a calculated choice, but as someone who had been quietly suffering for years. She looked at Gerald Foss when she said these things, not at me. Smart. Gerald Foss's expression shifted incrementally in her direction. The slight lean of a man whose sympathy is being professionally courted and who is beginning to respond to it. Then she asked for primary custody of Jaden. I kept my face still. Patricia wrote something on her notepad and slid it toward me. I didn't look at it, because across the room, in the chair against the wall where he had been sitting quietly since we arrived, Jaden was standing up. He stood slowly, the way he moves when he has made a decision and is certain of it. He is tall, my son. He gets that from my side. And when he stood in that sunlit conference room on Lamar Street, with his jaw set and his eyes wet and his hands trembling just slightly, he looked older than 16. He looked like someone who understood the full weight of what he was about to do and had chosen to do it anyway. He placed a small digital recorder on the table. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Dad, I don't want to do this to Mom, but I can't let her take everything Grandpa left for me." No one in that room made a sound. Patricia reached over and pressed play. Casey's voice came through the small speaker, steady, unhurried, completely certain of itself. "Your father doesn't deserve it. I'm going to take the whole company and start over. You're going to live with me." Then Jaden's voice on the recording, younger sounding, cracking slightly at the edges. "But what about Dad? What about Grandpa's company?" And Casey's voice, lower now, cooler. "That's not your concern. That's between me and the attorneys." Silence. The recording ended. Gerald Foss removed his glasses. Casey's attorney set down his pen. I did not look at Casey. I looked at Jaden. He was still standing. His hands were no longer trembling. His chin was level. He had done the hard thing. The adult, painful, irreversible hard thing. And he was still standing on the other side of it. I felt something in my chest that I don't have a clean word for. Not pride, though it was close to that. Something older and quieter. The feeling of watching your son become someone you were going to spend the rest of your life admiring. Then Kessie broke. She put her face in her hands, and the composed, calibrated performance dissolved entirely. What came out instead was the raw kind, unguarded, real. The sound of someone whose carefully built story has just been taken apart in front of witnesses. "Jaden, baby, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I promise I'll change." Jaden looked at his mother for a long, still moment. Then he sat back down without responding. That silence, a son's refusal to give his mother an easy answer in that moment, was, I think, the most painful thing Casey experienced in the entire process. More than the divorce papers. More than the public exposure. A mother's child looking at her with nothing left to say. Gerald Foss called a recess. We stood in the hallway. Patricia was reviewing documents. I stood near the window looking out at the city, at the Houston skyline in late morning, at the familiar geometry of a place I had built things in for 20 years. Then the conference room door opened behind us. She was a small woman, late 60s, I guessed. She wore a plain church dress and carried an old canvas bag over one arm, clearly heavy. She walked with the measured calm of someone who has been rehearsing a difficult thing for a long time and has finally decided that waiting any longer will cost more than going forward. Her name was Adeze. She was Kessie's mother. She placed the bag on the conference table and stood at the head of the room, in front of every attorney present, and she spoke without hesitation. "My daughter told me 8 years ago that she only married Brandon because of the construction company. She said she would stay until the business was strong enough, and then she would start over with someone she felt deserved her. I told her that was wrong. She stopped speaking to me for 2 years. She opened the bag and set documents on the table. Printed emails, handwritten journal pages, screenshots clipped together in neat stacks. evidence of a plan that had not begun 18 months ago, or 12 months ago, but years before any of us had been counting. I have emails, journal entries, and messages she sent to friends from years ago. I kept them because I hoped I would never need them. I am sorry that I need them today. She looked at Kessie then, and in that look was something ancient and complicated. The specific grief of a mother who loves her child and cannot protect that child from the person she chose to become. I cannot let my daughter keep hurting my grandson and destroying the Harlan family legacy. Kessie's attorney leaned close and whispered something. And Kessie, pale and hollow-eyed, with nothing left to construct and nowhere left to position herself, signed the divorce papers. She had nothing left to say. There was simply nothing left. I have thought many times since that day about what it costs a mother to walk into a room and testify against her own child. I do not minimize that. Adeze paid something real and permanent to do what she did, and I have never forgotten it. But I also think about what she understood, the thing Kessie never did. When you betray someone for personal gain, you do not only lose that person. You lose the people who loved you most. The courtroom is behind them now, but the most important conversation of this whole story is about to happen in the quiet of a driveway in the Woodlands, between a father and his son. We drove home to the Woodlands in the early afternoon quiet. Jaden sat in the passenger seat with his head turned toward the window, watching the Houston exits slide past one by one along I-45 North. He had been through more in that conference room than any 16-year-old should ever be asked to go through, and I gave him the space to be wherever he needed to be with it. There was no rush. The road was long enough. When I pulled into the driveway, neither of us got out right away. We sat in the truck for a while. The house looked exactly as it always had. The brick front, the rose bush along the walk doing quietly fine without anyone's attention, the basketball hoop in the driveway, standing straight and level against the afternoon sky. After a while, Jaden asked, "Dad, do you regret it?" He said it the way teenagers ask the questions that matter most, almost sideways, looking slightly away, as if the asking is the hard part and the answer will take care of itself once the words are out. I thought about what he was really asking, not just about the divorce, about all of it. About the drive home from the office with 2 plane tickets on the passenger seat. About the roses on the white desk. About every year before any of this. The long, careful years of building something, trusting someone, and believing. The way a man believes when he has no reason not to, that the life he is living is the one both people agreed to. I looked at my son. I don't regret trusting someone, I said. Trusting people is right. I only regret not seeing the truth sooner. And I regret what you were asked to carry, what you were asked to do today. No child should have to stand in a room like that to protect his father. That was too much, and I'm sorry it came to that. Jaden looked down at his hands. I chose to do it, he said quietly. I know, I said, and that is something I will never forget about you. We sat with that for a moment. Then I said, but I want to leave you with something from all of this. Not a lesson from a book, from this, from what happened to us. A man does not have to be strong every single second. That is not what strength means. He only has to be strong enough at the right moment to protect what matters most. And sometimes the thing that matters most isn't money or a contract or what people see when they look at you from the outside. Sometimes the thing that matters most is simply the truth. Standing beside it. Refusing to trade it in for something easier. Jaden nodded, slow and steady. Your grandfather knew that, I said. He built an entire company on it. And one day, that company is going to be yours. Not just the equipment and the contracts, the principle underneath it. That is the real inheritance. We got out of the truck. We went inside. I made sandwiches. Nothing elaborate, just what was in the refrigerator. Turkey and sharp cheddar on good bread. We sat at the kitchen table and ate without the television on, which we almost never do. It was quiet in the way the house gets on a still afternoon when the neighborhood has settled, and the only sounds are the ones that belong to the two of you. At some point, Jaden reached over and picked up his basketball from the chair where it had been sitting. He looked at it, then looked at me. You still never got me air, he said. Not complaining, almost smiling. I know, I said. We'll do it tomorrow. He set it back down, nodded. I reached over and rubbed the top of his head. The specific weight of my hand, brief and ordinary, the gesture I had been doing since he was small, and that he has technically been too old for about 3 years. He lets me do it anyway, and I am grateful for that every single time. I don't know what the future looks like. I want to be honest about that. I don't know what co-parenting will feel like 6 months from now, or what kind of relationship Jaden will eventually build with his mother when time does what time does to all things. I don't know if all those contracts will hold, or if some years ahead will be harder than the ones behind. But I know this. From that day forward, my son would not grow up inside a lie. He would not have to weigh loyalty against truth at the kitchen table. He would not carry secrets in his chest through basketball seasons and school nights. He would grow up knowing that when the hardest moment came, when everyone in the room was watching, he stood up and told the truth. And the truth held. To me, that is already a victory worth holding on to for a lifetime. This story reminds us that the truth has a texture you can hold in your hands, like the worn handle of a cast-iron skillet your mother used for 40 years, or the corner of a letter you never threw away but keep folded in the nightstand drawer. Tonight, before the lamp goes off, pull out one true thing you have been carrying quietly, something you never said out loud to anyone. Write it down on the back of an envelope the way people used to. Not to send it, just to let it exist outside of you. Some truths don't need an audience. They only need to be set down. That is enough. That has always been enough. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love or something you have lived through, leave a yes in the comments if you believe that quiet strength and truth always win in the end. Or a no if life has shown you otherwise. We would love to hear from you. This story was written by a human, with AI as a companion. It was born from a simple wish, to awaken the belief that kindness still exists, and no matter how many trials life brings, there are always moments of justice and quiet miracles waiting for those who deserve them. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.